Now, the SABC fired its head of news, Phathiswa Magopeni, on Friday. This comes after a disciplinary hearing found her guilty of misconduct and told the board to come up with an appropriate sanction. Magopeni has responded, saying that she will be challenging the SABC's decision. The South African National Editors Forum also responded in a statement alluding that the dismissal came before a panel had adjudicated serious allegations that Magopeni made against two top executives at the SABC. Civil society organizations have written to the SABC requesting that board chairperson Ntokozo Mazibuko and CEO Madoda Mxakwe be subjected to a hearing which will be open to members of the media. Joining us to weigh in on this conversation, we're joined by Professor Ylva Rodny Gumede, head of the Division for Internationalism and a professor at the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Gumede, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for joining us on Newsfeed, the AM edition. Your thoughts, let's start there, your thoughts on the firing of SABC head of news, Phathiswa Magopeni.
Well, thank you very, very much for having me. I think that what we're seeing here is something that has had a very, very tragic outcome, in the sense that we've been following this story for a long time. And, of course, we were all hoping that it wasn't going to come to this, and that, in particular, Phathiswa's case would be heard fairly. And I think that the outcome that she was fired means that she hasn't been heard fairly, to be quite frank.
Now, the decision, as you've said, was off the back of a disciplinary hearing into Phathiswa's conduct. The hearings were in a public forum. Members of the media, members of the public had access to it. In fact, chairperson of the hearing, Nazir Kasim, ruled that there was no evidence to suggest that Phathiswa deliberately defied a court order, which was, of course, at the heart of the issue. And he went on to recommend that she should be given a warning instead. Is it fair then, Dr. Gumede, that we're here today having a conversation about her firing and not necessarily her being issued with a warning as a form of sanction?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that they are connected, these issues, and we have to go sort of, I mean, this is, of course, now, it has become a labour issue, and she's been recommended then to take a case for unfair dismissal to the CCMA, for example. But the bigger issue here for us, as the public and also as the news media, as journalists ourselves, is about what lies behind the decision to fire her. I mean, in the first instance, and this is why I'm saying we need to go a little bit, take a step back, this case is not a case that should have led to any kind of issues bar a disciplinary hearing where all sides would have been heard. It would have been an internal investigation. What happened? Was there editorial interference, or did the editor then in chief, Phathiswa in this case, err in her duties when she screened this particular documentary that's been at the heart of this case? So I think that weighing up the issue of political interference on the one hand, or if there was a sort of a derelict of duties on behalf of Phathiswa, which there also doesn't seem to have been. So there shouldn't have been an issue, it should have been an investigation, it should have been left at that. But it's gone as far as to fire her, which then makes us question whether there is actually political interference here, as Phathiswa herself has pointed out.
Talking to your question posed there, what lies behind the decision? When a broadcaster, Professor, fires its head of news, the head of news that is known for being responsible for a lot of good changes that have taken place at the broadcaster, when that happens, does it usually point to something deeper, a sort of irretrievable breakdown of the relationship between the head and the broadcaster, something, of course, that the public would not necessarily be privy to? And if that is the case, what kinds of questions should we, as the public, be asking?
It should take a lot for something to come to this. I would imagine that someone would have really erred in their duties. And what we must understand, that as journalists, we really pride ourselves on our professionalism. So when we step into the role as journalists, when we step into the newsroom, when we go out on assignments, when we make editorial decisions, in the line of of the work that we do. We pride ourselves on our professionalism, and I think that there are a few journalists who wouldn't say that that is at the core of what we do, because that is how we hold the public's trust. And almost so is that important then for a public broadcaster that pretends to work for the public and in the public interest. So for a news editor at this level to be fired, you would imagine that there would have been a real step down from her, sort of a breakdown in terms of having erred in her duties of professionalism, gone against the codes of conduct and codes of ethics, the press code of South Africa, as we call it, which, doesn't seem to be the case here. So that's why we're asking these questions about what has triggered this, what is behind the decision to go so far as to fire someone.
Well, if indeed we are dealing with, as you've said, a conclusive breakdown in relationship between the head and the broadcaster, where does that leave the public broadcaster?
You see, this is an interesting question, because if there is so that there's something more sinister behind the decision to fire Phathiswa, and then we are in trouble. And we've spoken a little bit about this before, and that is the fact that as a public broadcaster, your mandate is to work in the interest of the public, of the all South African citizens. And we need an independent broadcaster where there's a lot of editorial independence. And if you fire someone because you think that they have actually been too independent, or actually if there is political interference where there's then perceptions that the head of news is actually, working against, for example, a political party, then we are in trouble, because then we can say that a public broadcaster is no longer independent, and then it shouldn't be called a public broadcaster, quite frankly. And I think this is at the heart of the issue here. And this idea then of public interest and public trust is something that's so fragile. And I've been thinking about it in the, for example, context of COVID. If we don't have clear independence in our public broadcaster, and clear editorial independence, which is what the head of news, Phathiswa Magopeni, has been fighting for, then the public will not get the stories that they need. And take then the COVID-19 story, for example, and the COVID pandemic, all the information that we have been needed as a public and that needed to be fairly assessed. If we would have had interference and gotten loop-sided information about the effectiveness of vaccinations, for example, then we wouldn't have been able to take the decisions as an informed citizen that we need to do. The same goes, of course, for politics, elections, etc.
Professor, just in closing, I mean, you've mentioned the importance of any broadcaster to have that level of independence as a way of assuring the public that what they're getting, the information that they're getting, hasn't been interfered with in any way. And then, of course, we've got Phathiswa Magopeni's own allegations regarding interference from the higher-ups in the public broadcaster. And, of course, we know that there have been calls made, including SANEF making those calls for an investigation into those allegations. How should that investigation or that inquiry or those hearings be conducted to ensure that they are happening in an open and a transparent manner, and to ensure that it satisfies the South African public to the level, to the degree that they can feel as though, or be rest assured rather, that the South African public broadcaster is still in good hands and it is still able to afford South Africans independent, impartial news?
Now, to answer the latter question, there the onus is upon the public broadcaster to scrutinize its own coverage, to give us the kind of coverage that is balanced, that is fair, that is independent. And the question here is, will it be able to do so when it's gone as far as then firing its own editor-in-chief? And I think that's hugely problematic. But to the first question, I think that here we are very, very lucky in South Africa that we still have strong fora such as SANEF, for example, the South African National Editors Forum. and who can insist, and a journalistic corps that can insist on covering these kind of issues. And I think that the coverage so far has been really well. And we did push very hard to have access to the hearings, for example, to be able to discern what actually happened, what were the issues at stake. And now I think we need to start dissecting what's behind the decision to fire the head of news, like the organization has done, and keep watching what's happening at the SABC so that we can ensure that we continue to have the public broadcaster with the emphasis on public that works in the public interest that we want.
Right, Professor, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us. That was Professor Ylva Rodny Gumede, Head of the Division for Internationalisation and a Professor in the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg.